Story 1. The House That Whispered for Help. Sarah Miller had been an EMT for 8 years, long enough to handle almost anything: car accidents, heart attacks, even the occasional bizarre call. But nothing prepared her for the mystery of 742 Maple Street. Over the past week, she and her partner, Mike, had been dispatched to that address 3 times. Each time, the call came through the same way: a faint, desperate voice on the line, pleading for help. Yet, when they arrived, the house stood silent and empty. The first call came on a rainy Monday night. Sarah remembered the dispatcher's voice crackling through the radio. 742 Maple Street. Possible medical emergency. She and Mike sped through the wet streets, sirens wailing against the darkness, only to find a 2-story house with peeling gray paint and a sagging porch. The windows stared blankly into the night like hollow eyes, and the front door released a mournful creak as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was still, unnaturally still. No injured person, no signs of disturbance. Just an empty living room with faded wallpaper and a single wooden chair positioned precisely in the corner. "Probably just kids playing pranks," Mike said, scratching his stubbled chin. "Happens all the time." Sarah nodded, but something gnawed at her. The house didn't feel abandoned. The floors were swept clean, and a faint scent of pine lingered in the air, as if someone had just finished cleaning. They left, recording it as a false alarm, but Sarah couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like the damp night air. 2 days later, the second call came. Same address, same urgency in the dispatcher's tone. This time, Sarah noticed lights flickering faintly through the windows as they pulled up to the curb. Her heart quickened as they approached the door, but again the house was deserted. The flickering stopped the moment they crossed the threshold, leaving them in dim silence. By the third call on Friday evening, Sarah's curiosity had transformed into a cold, creeping dread. "Mike, something's not right here," she said as they drove away from yet another empty house. 3 calls in 1 week and nothing? This isn't normal." Mike shrugged. "Maybe the phone lines are crossed. Technology isn't perfect." But Sarah couldn't let it go. That night she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her laptop, determined to uncover the truth about 742 Maple Street. She started with public records, then dug into newspaper archives. After 2 hours of searching, she found it. A yellowed article from 1996. "Hero paramedic dies in line of duty," the headline declared. The story told of Jacob Thompson, a paramedic who had perished in a fire while trying to rescue a child from a burning apartment building. He was 32, known for his courage and dedication. The house he'd called home? 742 Maple Street. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She scrolled down and froze at the photograph. Jacob, standing by the front door of the house, his dark hair tousled, a warm smile on his face. The image was dated just weeks before his death. She stared at it, her mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, she tracked down Tom Reynolds, a retired paramedic who'd worked with Jacob. They met at a diner, where Tom sipped black coffee with trembling hands and shared stories of the past. "Jacob was a legend among us," Tom said, his voice rough with age and emotion. "Always the first to run into danger. When he died, it broke something in all of us. That fire, he got the child out, but the roof collapsed before he could escape." "What about his house?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. Tom's eyes darkened. "After he passed, it sat empty. No one wanted it. People started saying it was haunted. Lights turning on and off, voices in the night. They said Jacob never really left." That evening, Sarah returned to 742 Maple Street alone. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. The house loomed before her, its windows reflecting the dying light like pools of dark water. She stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The house felt different this time, heavier, as if the air itself carried weight. As she moved through the living room, a faint groan echoed from below her feet. Sarah froze. The sound came again, louder, drawing her toward the basement stairs. With a shaky breath, she descended into darkness. The air grew damp and chilly, raising goosebumps on her arms. Her flashlight beam landed on an old suitcase in the corner, coated in a thick layer of dust. She knelt and opened it with trembling fingers, revealing a stack of yellowed papers and photographs. One caught her eye. Jacob by the front door, just like the newspaper photo. But this time, a little girl stood beside him, clutching his hand. Sarah turned the photo over. Jacob and Emily, 1995, it read in faded ink. Her pulse quickened. The article had mentioned a child in the fire. Could this be her? A sudden bang jolted her upright. The basement door slammed shut, and the light overhead flickered wildly, casting frantic shadows across the walls. Sarah lunged for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her as she pounded on the wood, her shouts swallowed by the pressing silence. Then a cold draft brushed her neck, and a whisper filled the air. "Help me." She spun around, heart hammering against her ribs. No one was there. The whisper came again, soft and pleading. "Help me find peace." Sarah's fear gave way to clarity. This was Jacob, or what remained of him. He was trapped, tethered to this house by unfinished business. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice trembling in the stillness. "Find Emily," the whisper replied, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Tell her I tried." The door creaked open on its own, and the flickering stopped. Sarah stumbled out, clutching the photo, her mind set on a new mission. It took 4 days to track down Emily Harper. She was 32 now, living 2 towns over. Sarah met her at a quiet park, the photo in hand. As she explained the calls, the house, and Jacob's message, Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I was the child in that fire," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I've carried the guilt my whole life. If I hadn't been there, playing where I shouldn't have been, he'd still be alive." "He wanted you to know he tried to save you," Sarah said softly. "And he succeeded. He doesn't blame you." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." After that meeting, the calls to 742 Maple Street stopped. Sarah never heard that desperate voice again. The house still stands, its gray paint peeling in the wind, its windows dark and watchful. Sometimes, on quiet nights, people passing by claim to see a faint light moving from room to room, as if someone is checking the premises one last time. Sarah likes to think Jacob finally found peace, his message delivered across the divide between the living and the dead, a final act of duty from a hero who never stopped caring, even after his heart stopped beating. But sometimes, when her radio crackles with a new emergency call, she swears she can hear his voice in the static, guiding her to those who need help the most. Story 2. The Call from Maple Street. The evening sky hung heavy with dusk as Sarah and Emily's ambulance rolled to a stop before the old Victorian house on Maple Street. The emergency call had crackled through their radio only minutes earlier. A child had fallen down the stairs. As they stepped onto the crumbling walkway, the house loomed before them, its weathered facade telling stories of neglect and abandonment. Paint peeled from the siding like dead skin, and untamed ivy crept up the walls, choking the structure in a slow, patient embrace. The garden had surrendered to wilderness years ago, weeds whispering secrets among themselves as a cool breeze stirred their tangled stems. Among the many vacant windows, only one upstairs showed signs of life, a faint, flickering light that pulsed like a hesitant heartbeat. The front door creaked open before they could knock, revealing a woman in her late 40s, her face a canvas of sorrow and exhaustion. Mrs. Thompson stood framed in the doorway, her silver-streaked hair hanging loose around shoulders draped in a faded floral dress that seemed to belong to another era. "Good evening, ma'am," Sarah said, her voice carrying the practiced blend of authority and compassion she'd perfected over 7 years as an EMT. "We received a call about a child falling down the stairs at this address." Mrs. Thompson's bloodshot eyes widened slightly, confusion rippling across her features. "There's no child here," she murmured. her voice barely audible above the whisper of the evening wind. "My son. He passed away 3 years ago. He fell down those stairs." Emily felt a chill spider walk up her spine, despite the lingering warmth of the summer evening. She exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, who maintained her professional composure. "Ma'am," Emily pressed gently, "dispatch received an emergency call from this address less than 10 minutes ago." Mrs. Thompson shook her head slowly, deliberately. "I didn't call anyone. There must be some mistake." Despite her words, she stepped aside, allowing them entry into the dimly lit foyer. The interior air hung thick with dust and stillness. The house felt suspended in time, a museum of grief where nothing had been touched or moved in years. No cheerful photos adorned the walls. No scattered toys betrayed the presence of a child. The silence pressed against their ears, broken only by the hollow echo of their footsteps on the hardwood floor. As they approached the staircase, a steep, imposing structure of dark wood, Sarah's boot connected with something small. Bending down, she retrieved a child's shoe, its blue fabric faded and scuffed, layered with the same dust that coated everything else in the house. "Mrs. Thompson," Sarah began, holding up the tiny shoe, "does this belong—" The woman's gaze locked onto the shoe, her face draining of what little color it had. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Those were his. He wore them the day he fell." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unsettling. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. The emergency call had been clear. Dispatch had confirmed this exact address. Yet here they stood in a house preserved in grief, facing a mother who spoke of a tragedy long past. Emily, ever practical, pulled out her phone. "Let's verify the call details," she said, her fingers tapping the screen. The log glowed back at her. An emergency call, time-stamped 9 minutes ago from this very house. But the number showed as unregistered, a dead end. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice dropping to match the hushed atmosphere of the house. Mrs. Thompson's gaze drifted toward the staircase, her expression softening into something almost like longing. "Sometimes," she confessed, her voice barely audible, "I hear him, his laughter, his little feet running upstairs. At first, I thought grief was driving me mad, but now I wonder if he's still here with me somehow." Emily shifted uncomfortably, her medical training at odds with the creeping unease of the situation. Sarah, however, felt a surge of empathy for the woman's palpable loss. "Mrs. Thompson," she asked gently, "are you managing okay here by yourself?" The woman offered a sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not alone, dear. He's here, in his own way." She gestured vaguely toward the upper floor. "Some nights I swear I can hear him calling for me." Emily frowned, concern etching lines between her brows. "Have you considered speaking with someone? A counselor perhaps, or a support group for parents who've experienced loss?" Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "I've tried everything. Nothing fills this emptiness. But sometimes—" She paused, her gaze turning inward. "Sometimes I think he's trying to tell me something, that he's okay, wherever he is now." As the EMTs turned to leave, a sound froze them in place. A faint creak from upstairs, followed by what might have been a child's giggle, light and fleeting. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her heart suddenly pounding. Emily nodded, her professional skepticism wavering as color drained from her face. They both looked toward the staircase, but the house had fallen silent again, as if holding its breath. Mrs. Thompson showed no reaction. Either she hadn't heard it, or she was so accustomed to these sounds that they no longer registered. Outside, night had fully claimed the sky, streetlights casting elongated shadows across Maple Street. As they climbed into their ambulance, neither spoke for several moments, the weight of the encounter settling between them. "What do you think happened back there?" Sarah finally asked, staring out the window at the old Victorian, now just a dark silhouette against the night sky. Emily gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening. "I don't know. Could be a system error, a crossed line somewhere." She paused. Or... The unfinished thought hung between them as Emily started the engine. Back at the station, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of that house. According to the records they'd checked 3 years ago, that home had been filled with the energy of a 6-year-old boy, his laughter, his joy, his endless questions. One tragic misstep had silenced all of that, leaving his mother to gather the fragments of her shattered life. Was the mysterious call a glitch in the system, a cruel prank? Or had they brushed against something beyond their understanding, a desperate plea from a child who couldn't move on? The memory of that barely there giggle followed Sarah home that night, lingering in her dreams. For days afterward, she found herself checking the call logs, half expecting to see another emergency from Maple Street. Emily buried herself in paperwork, though her eyes occasionally betrayed her lingering unease. The incident became a story they shared only in hushed voices during quiet overnight shifts, a reminder that some emergencies defied their medical training and protocol, touching instead on the fragile boundary between life and what might exist beyond it. And for Mrs. Thompson, alone in that house on Maple Street, perhaps it was confirmation of what she already knew, that love, even in the face of devastating loss, finds ways to persist that science cannot explain. That sometimes, when the night is quiet and the old house settles, the line between memory and reality blurs just enough to allow a mother one more chance to hear her child's laughter echo down the stairs. Story 3. A night in Detroit. It was a frigid night in Detroit, the kind where the wind didn't just blow, it whispered old secrets through abandoned streets. 2 paramedics, Mike and Alex, huddled in the downtown EMS headquarters, the fluorescent lights above them buzzing like trapped insects. Mike, a veteran with 15 years of witnessing humanity at its most vulnerable, nursed a cup of coffee gone cold. Across from him sat Alex, only 2 years into the job, still believing they could save everyone. The radio crackled, slicing through their silence with an electronic rasp. Unit 7, respond to a distress call at 1456 Maple Street. Police are on scene. Proceed with caution. Mike's hand moved automatically, muscle memory from 1,000 similar calls. Unit 7 en route. His eyes met Alex's, who was already gathering their equipment, the weight of anticipation settling between them. Let's roll. Their ambulance carved through the darkness, red and blue lights painting the snow-dusted streets in alternating hues of urgency. 10 minutes later, they pulled up to a small bungalow that seemed to sink into itself, as if the very structure was exhausted by its own existence. A police cruiser sat out front, its lights casting long shadows that danced across the weathered siding. Officer Peterson stood at the door, his usual stoic demeanor fractured. When he saw the paramedics approach, something in his expression shifted, a warning without words. "I've been on the force for 12 years, he said, voice uncharacteristically unsteady. "Never seen anything quite like this." The house seemed to exhale as they stepped inside, a sigh of stale air carrying the metallic tang of copper and something deeper, more primal. The living room told a story of chaos, furniture overturned, glass from shattered picture frames glittering like fallen stars on the hardwood floor, dark stains spreading like ink blots across faded wallpaper. In the center of it all sat a lone chair, and in it, Sarah Johnson. She was motionless, head bowed as if in prayer or surrender. Her arms rested on the chair's wooden armrests, marked with evidence of her final struggle. Nearby lay objects that shouldn't have been there, tools meant for creation, not destruction, now tainted with purpose. Alex's breath caught, a small sound that seemed thunderous in the silent room. Mike placed a steadying hand on his partner's shoulder, grounding him in the moment. "Focus," he murmured. "Remember your training." They approached with practiced movements, though nothing could truly prepare them for the stillness they found. Sarah's skin had taken on the pallor of winter moonlight, and her eyes, still open, reflected nothing. The officer spoke from the doorway, each word measured. Sarah Johnson, 32 years old. Neighbors reported concerning noises. We got here too late. Mike nodded, cataloging details with professional detachment, a shield built from years of similar scenes. Alex, however, couldn't look away from Sarah's face, from the story etched into the lines around her eyes. What makes someone feel this is the only escape? He whispered. Mike sighed, his voice carrying the weight of too many similar questions. Sometimes the darkness inside becomes more real than anything else. They can't see beyond it anymore. They worked methodically, documenting what needed to be recorded, preparing her with dignity for her final journey. As they lifted her, Mike noticed a photograph near the chair. Sarah smiling between two older adults, her parents perhaps. Joy captured in a moment that seemed impossible now. Outside, the winter air bit at their exposed skin, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere they'd left behind. They secured the stretcher in the ambulance as Officer Peterson approached. "Thanks for handling this," he said, gratitude and shared burden in his tone. "All part of it," Mike replied simply. The drive back was silent, both men lost in thoughts they couldn't fully articulate. The city slept on around them, oblivious to how permanently the world had changed for one family tonight. At the station, after paperwork and cleaning, Alex finally broke the silence in the break room. "How do you not carry these calls with you forever?" His voice was small against the hum of the vending machine. Mike considered his response carefully, rolling his empty cup between his palms. "You do carry them. They become part of you, but you learn to make room for them without letting them consume you." He paused, searching for words to explain the inexplicable. "It's like holding something precious and terrible at the same time. You honor it by remembering and by being better prepared for the next person who needs you." Alex nodded slowly, his gaze distant. Her eyes haunted me. So much pain. "That's why we do this," Mike said. "Because behind every call like tonight's are dozens we get to in time. People we reach before they feel that alone." When their shift ended at dawn, they stepped outside into the gray light of morning. Detroit was stirring to life. People heading to work, coffee shops opening their doors, the world continuing its steady rotation. Yet for Mike and Alex, something had shifted. An invisible thread connecting them to that small house on Maple Street. As they walked to their cars, Alex looked up at the fading stars. Think we'll ever understand it? Why people reach that point? Mike watched his breath form clouds in the cold air. Maybe not entirely, but we can listen better, notice the signs, remember that everyone's fighting battles we can't always see. In the distance, sirens wailed, another call, another story unfolding. The city breathed on, carrying with it countless hidden struggles, countless silent cries. And two paramedics, forever changed by a night in Detroit, prepared to answer the next call, knowing that sometimes saving a life meant recognizing the darkness before it consumed someone completely.